Okay. Chodesh Tov. This time I want to talk about what I think is one of the most fundamental ideas in Rav Shagar's thought. You might touch on the fact that he connects it very strongly to Purim, which is coming up, but we're going to try and focus on the idea itself, which is bitachon, the traditional idea, very big in the Musar school. And it means something like a religious sense of trust, a sense of like trusting God is a bitachon.
Does Rav Shagar differentiate between bitachon and emunah?
No, he's gonna. He doesn't. They don't mean the same thing to him, but he doesn't use that contrast to say, like, oh, one's one thing and one's another. He wants to talk about what bitachon is in and of itself.
He does talk about emunah.
Like emunah, yeah, he talks about emunah somewhere else. Happy to talk about that at length. I've written papers on it.
Cool.
But I was just open up the table for a second. Like, what do you guys think of when you hear the word bitachon? What does that mean to you?
It means that everything God does has secured, trust God. Everything He does is for the good.
Everything God does is for the good. Anyone else?
You put yourself in God's hand and He takes care of you.
Yeah, so you're saying it's a way of understanding what God does. You're saying it's a way of like what you do in relationship to God. They're very similar aspects of the same larger concept. Anyone else? So I think what I really want to run with here is what you said, the idea that the idea that everything God does is for the good. That's really sort of where Rav Shagar is going to see the importance of bitachon and what it is in a way I think is a little uncommon, a way people don't necessarily think it all the way out. But I actually want to start with a slightly different topic, with a Gemara from Brachot. It talks about what's called Yisurim Shel Ahava, sufferings of love. Anyone feel like reading the first source? Yeah, go for it.
Talmud Bavli, Brachot, Rabban Shamsi Rav Chizda said, if a person sees that suffering has befallen him, he should examine his actions. If he examines his ways and found no transgression, he may be confident that these are afflictions of love. As it is stated, for whom the Lord loves, He rebukes. Rechia bar Abba fell ill. Rabbi Yochanan entered to visit him and said to him, is your suffering dear to you? He said to him, I welcome neither the suffering nor its reward. I don't want either of these. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, give me your hand. Rechia bar Abba gave him his hand, and Rabbi Yochanan stood him up and restored him to health. Similarly, Rabbi Yochanan fell ill. Rabbi Chanina entered to visit him and said to him, is your suffering dear to you? Rabbi Yochanan said to him, I welcome neither the suffering nor its reward. Rabbi Chanina said to him, give me your hand. He said, gave him his hand. And Rabbi Chanina stood him up and restored him to health.
Okay, so this Gemara is from a long back and forth discussion across the entirety of Brachot Hey, pretty much this page of Brachot, about suffering and the meaning of suffering and the ability to understand things that are happening to you. And so an important part of it is this first section we have here. If a person sees that suffering has befallen him, he should examine his actions. Bifeish ma'asav in the original. And if you examine your actions, you found no transgressions, then you know these are Yisurim Shel Ahava, afflictions of love. The Gemara then goes back and forth trying to decide what exactly counts as Yisurim Shel Ahava. Discussions like, you reach into your coin and you grab the wrong, you reach into your pocket for coins, you grab the wrong coins. But also, like, if you neglected to study Torah, can you explain suffering based on that? Or is that not a big enough deal? And if it still counts as Yisurim Shel Ahava if your only sin was, wasting time instead of studying Torah. But the key point there is that Yisurim Shel Ahava is ultimately when you suffer in some way and you can't explain it. You try to find some way of justifying why this sin is happening, and you ultimately experience it as meaningless.
Is that what the question, is your suffering dear to you, means? Meaning he's asking it to say, do you find value in your suffering, apparently?
So this is the end of this whole long back and forth about meaningless suffering and the possibility of experiencing the suffering as something that comes from God. Finally, then you have this back and forth between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chia. And Rabbi Yochanan is one of the people who's a proponent of the idea. Sometimes you suffer and it's sufferings of love. and Rabbi Chia essentially rejects this idea. He says, I am not interested in some sort of suffering that I attribute to God because I can't understand it.
But then Rabbi Yochanan has the same situation there.
So there seems to be that Rabbi Yochanan agrees with him, ultimately. That the conclusion of this Gemara, which does seem to say that there's this, if you are suffering, you have something that's bothering you, it could be as little as, reaching into your pocket for a coin and grabbing the wrong coin, as the Gemara suggests, that could be from God. And the conclusion of the Gemara is this back and forth between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chia, Bar Abba, where they help each other out of their suffering. Where they say, ultimately this isn't worth it to me, this divine but meaningless suffering, and I would rather, not have it, and the other person is able to help them out of it. So, yeah.
Do you understand what does that mean, that or alternatively Rabbi Yochanan helps him up and heals him, right?
No, I think the Gemara doesn't give us enough details to be exploring, like, the method for either them falling ill or, getting better. The point here is of the structure of each little story, of they get ill, they speak to another person who asks them, are you interested in this kind of suffering? And they say no. The other person reaches out to them and they get better. There's sort of several steps in each individual narrative where the person rejects the possibility of I can't accept this suffering. I'm not interested in suffering, and the other person helps them out of it.
Even if it's suffering from love, this is a garika, which there's some deeper meaning going in. Like, so, what's the message here? I guess.
So, I think you could you look for a lot of different messages and all the details of it. What I'm interested in here, what I think is striking, is the contrast between the beginning part that I brought. Once again, I've skipped some stuff in the middle, but it's mostly trying to iron out the details of this idea of sufferings of love. But this first paragraph here is giving a very passive picture, right? Things are happening to you, and you examine to see if there's some possible way of explaining it, and if not, then you can say this suffering is a suffering of love. The second part, these two stories at the end, are, there's suffering, let's do something about it. Right? It's a lot less clear what they're doing, but minimally there's some degree of, give me your hand. He gave him his hand and he got better. Or when the response to suffering is some sort of action.
So do we accept suffering or do we try to escape it?
Right, I think that's
parallel.
As much as there's the details might give a richer picture, I think that's the core of what happens over the course of this discussion.
Right. Well, if you're a rabbi who has magic powers, then you can do whatever you want. Right? But if you're not, then you have to deal with it.
That would be one possibility.
But it's also, even if we're getting the rabbis with magic powers for a second here, there are ways to either deal with issues or to escape them. Or I'm suffering now. Should I accept this? Or either turn the other cheek, or no, I'm not. Do you accept suffering, or do you try to alleviate it?
I also
with or without magic.
Think that it's worth noting this isn't framed in terms of who can or can't, fix things, as opposed to about which rabbis can make magical cucumbers and things. That gets brought up. So that's not being put on the table here. And what is being put on the table is I'm not interested in the suffering. Let me help you out of it.
So, on the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, I think that there is a supernatural element to the story which I think that we shouldn't ignore. Right, in the sense that so you could say, well, I don't want this affliction, and therefore I'll take medicine, and that sort of there's no sort of element of sort of talking to God or interacting with God. And telling God, I don't want neither this affliction nor its reward. Here there does seem to be an element of that. In other words, these magical rabbinic powers, I think there is sort of an aspect of prayer, or an aspect of I have a decision. God, you gave me this punishment so that I will get a reward, and I'm making the decision that I don't want the affliction or the reward.
So I want to say just that we do need to move on, and I'm going to use this as a basis for getting into where Rav Shigar wants to get at. But I would think that you need to do some more work to show there's where God comes into that story at the end, or prayer or magic, because that's not clear at the very least. Anyone else have something before we move on?
Just
Yes.
Professor Chaim had an interesting explanation of this.
Extra's explanations, I think we should wait till the end. I'm very happy to hear it. I just
Okay.
don't want to get too off track. Certainly not here at the beginning. So for anyone who just joined us,
I couldn't find like
Yeah,
I,
it's-
9 versus 11. Maybe put like a little
the
sign
sign
on
is
the
poor,
outside
you're
of
right.
the.
It's a good
Yeah.
idea.
Like in this building, it's big, but on the outside, there's
Yeah.
no sign.
so
Yeah.
just
You're
That's
right.
tricky.
quickly, we're talking about bitachon, and as a starting point, we look at this Gemara that gives sort of two options. One is yisurim shel hava, sufferings or afflictions of love. The idea that there's no way you can explain why you're experiencing some sort of suffering, then it's something that comes from God. The Gemara doesn't explain why it's coming from God. That's something that gets debated, but it's from God. And the other approach is, from the end of the Gemara, is people say, I'm not really interested in that kind of suffering, and the other rabbi helps them out, and they sort of heal them. And that goes back and forth. So what I want to move into here is the first of two approaches Rav Shigar has to bitachon. We're going to see both of them. This first one here is going to be his more dominant approach. And he starts off by talking about our Gemara. I'll read this first piece. It's from a book called Bayomahu, which is about drashot Rav Shigar gave for Moadei Iyar, the holidays that the State of Israel and the religious Zionist community created to celebrate the various landmarks. So this one is from a drasha for Yom HaShoah, where he talks about issues of suffering and God and stuff. And he says here, he's going to contrast this Yisurim Sh'ahava approach with what he sees as sort of more classically religious approach of the Chazon Ish. The great difference between the two mindsets of faith, there is no death without sin, and he may be confident that these are sufferings of love, has implications for many fundamental topics in religious life. For example, the differing views of the Chazon Ish on the one hand and Rabbeinu Bechaya on the other regarding the topic of bitachon. The Chazon Ish, in his book Emunah Bitachon, says that trust in God comes from faith in divine justice and providence. Not from faith that everything will be good, but from faith that everything will be done through justice and providence. In contrast, Rabbeinu Bechaya said, I have never found myself in a situation and wish that it were otherwise. From his perspective, trust in God is rooted in equanimity. The individual is happy in instances, whatever they may be, due to his faith that they express God's will, and that God's will is the good. This is a circular thought process because someone who believes that everything is God's will and that God's will is the good is willing to accept it as good. He will experience it as good. Okay, so this piece, source number 2, Rav Shigar lays out, he sees two different ways of relating to suffering. One, in the Gemara, Ein mitzvah below avon, there's no death without sin. And another is Yisurim Sh'ahava, the sufferings of love. He says that the Chazon Ish is perhaps the greatest explainer of this idea. There is no death without sin. That if there's some sort of suffering or death, then there must be some human action and sin that can explain why it happened. This is rooted in the Gemara in the discussion of Adam Harishon. The first sin is said to have caused brought death into the world. God said, on the day you eat from it, you will die. And be able to explain why they don't die immediately. But the tradition says that that's sort of when death becomes a problem for humanity is only after there's sin. And so too on an individual level, Chazon Ish says, if you experience some sort of suffering, it's because of a sin. The problem that would lead to is, well, what if I can't find any sins? Like, what if I think that I, didn't sin?
Think better.
What?
Think
Right,
better.
so that's the Chazon Ish's answer. As opposed to, we saw of sufferings of love, the Chazon Ish says our starting point, the fundamental assumption is God is just and, in control of everything. So everything happens according to justice. If you don't understand it, it's because you can't see the bigger picture. But if you can see the bigger picture, you'd understand why you're supposed to be suffering now. The second approach, we choose.
But just so Yisurim Shel Ahava though is also can be part of that framework in the sense that
It's not a stira. It's not a contradiction.
Right. In other words, the idea of Yisurim Shel Ahava is that you will be punished if you go through painful ordeals. God will reward you for that. That you get some sort of plus in Olam Haba. Right, so in that sense, it's not contradicting the idea of divine justice, because eventually you'll be rewarded.
So that's how Rav Gaon explains Yisurim Shel Ahava.
Mm-hmm.
It's not how the Rambam explains it, probably. The Rambam rejects it anyways. He says Yisurim Shel Ahava is a minority opinion, and we don't hold like that. And it's not how the Hasidim and other people explained it. Like, you're right, it could mean that. But
Because I think that's shot in the Gemara above, right? The Gemara above says that there's some sort of reward associated with
it doesn't
these
change the reward. The Gemara just...
I don't want the suffering and I don't want the reward.
Right.
Lo him velo scharan is a phrase that comes up in Chazal that just means not it or its consequence. So another example would be when Chazal get rid of the Yitzhar Kavod Zara, I believe it uses the phrase lo him velo scharan. And
I
let
don't
me
think
think.
so.
No, I'm
I
thinking
think
of
it only
the
shows up
Maharal
in the
Chazal.
Sugya.
You're right. But so that's possible. But it's certainly, I would say, not a necessary explanation because Lohim v'lo scharan isn't, or schar is not referred to in context of. Sorry, one second. The Gemara doesn't directly juxtapose the two. It doesn't say these sufferings have a reward that is the Yisurim Shel Ahava or something. So minimally, there's room for the other interpreters who came later to say what they said, which is where Rosh Hashanah is taking off from. So, of the range of interpretations of what Yisurim Shel Ahava are, Rosh Hashanah is going to be going with, he says Rabbeinu Bachaya here, who is one of the Rishonim, wrote a book called Chovot and Levavot, one of the first sort of books of philosophical, ethical work, but also the Balatanya is someone who this comes up for. The later in the essay this is taken from, he talks about the Piaseczner Rebbe, who famously, went through the Holocaust in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he's working off a approach that is definitely not a necessary reading of the idea of Yisurim Shel Ahava. You could put those two together. I do believe the Gemara contrasts Mita Below Avon and Yisurim Shel Ahava. The idea that there's no death without sin, and Yisurim Shel Ahava, but you could still find ways to put them together, as you said. Okay, so that was the Chazon Ish's approach. 1 second, I'm going to get to the Rabbeinu Bachaya's approach here. In contrast, Rabbeinu Bachaya said, "I have never found myself in a situation and wish that it were otherwise." From his perspective, trust in God is rooted in equanimity. The individual is happy in instances, whatever they may be, due to his faith that they express God's will, and that God's will is the good. This is a circular thought process, because someone who believes that everything is God's will and that God's will is good is willing to accept it as good and will experience good. Regard saying that for Rabbeinu Bachaya, bitachon is a posture towards the things that happen that starts with the idea that they're good. It doesn't start with the idea that they're just or right, but they're good. And how does that work? Is by saying that what's good is God's will, and everything that happens is God's will. So just by definition, everything that happens is good. Rosh Hashanah is laying on the table. That's a circular thought process. Yes.
But that may be on one level, but in practice, halacha demands from us to react to certain occurrences negatively. When your relative dies, you sit shiva, right? You have to mourn them. That's something that you're reacting to that, and yes, maybe on some level intellectually, you understand that kol magoy well and everything's good, but you are supposed to. We don't operate on that level in this world.
Right. So I think there's one. I think the possibility of separating these two discussions. Like you could say, well, we have this discussion of what is bitachon and what does halacha demand of us, and how do those two things interact?
Two levels of consciousness.
They could be separate. They could be things we work at different times. But I will say just that you're right. And in the next source we see, Rosh Hashanah is going to refer to this idea of bitachon as almost inhuman. That it requires really stepping out of and transcending a normal human way of understanding the world.
How is it circular?
Well, it's circular because you define what happens as good, essentially. You start by saying everything is God's will, and God's will is good, and therefore everything is good. But because you said everything is God's will...
Yeah, but how else do you want to define the good?
What? Well, the good might have... trying to define the good...
I said the good is God's will.
So
That's the good.
the
Question is then
the ability to define.
how do you define it?
I was saying, so the ability to, or the possibility of defining what the good is something that's just everyone's been arguing about forever. But a minimal way might be saying
But
that.
so by saying that somebody who has a clear understanding of what, clear position in the question that is circular,
Okay, so
you're not making a point.
So I think what Rosh Hagar's
Yeah,
point
that's
is,
the good.
is about.
That's it, the good.
Yeah, but what his point is about it being
And you
circular.
to provide another definition.
Right. So he's saying one example of what the good might be is what people experience as good, as pleasant.
Good for them, not the good.
What? Well, no. They might say
Okay.
that is the good. Like Rabbeinu Bachai, that's as much an assertion.
How would that be possible?
Like it's just as possible as saying God's will is
What's
the good.
for you isn't good for somebody else. So immediately it cannot be the good.
No, but you could say, okay,
The
what,
good for you
what's
cannot
good?
be the good for somebody else, right?
Well,
The good for everybody is in contradictions.
no, you could say the best thing for everybody. And
Like that's possible.
you say, let's get an average amount of good as best as we can be for everyone, not perfect for anybody. We figure it out. Like that's what people do in society. We try and create a society where things are as good as possible for as many people.
Oh, yeah?
Which
But
is
so
not
the-
Rabbeinu Bachai's definition.
No, it's not Rabbeinu Bachai.
Rabbeinu Bachai's definition
Rabbeinu Bachai-
is God's will.
God's
That's it.
will.
That's it.
And Shagar's point of being circular is that you experience
But
everything as...
you're right that what you're saying is very, very weak, right?
My-
When you say the good,
so, yes, so...
everybody hears something absolute.
Yes.
And then you tell me compromise, what's
No, it's saying yourself...
the best as possible, not the
Right.
less worse as possible.
So it's not
It's not
weak
the good.
per se because...
What you're saying, no. You have to go until the end of both consequences of what you're saying.
No, you're that 100%.
You're saying there is not the good.
Yeah.
The idea of the good has to be abandoned. And you have to come up with something else.
Sure. So that would be a position
But
that
then
we
again,
have no idea.
how do you want to criticize Bechai? Bechai
I'm-
says the good is, and that's what it is.
What?
Like, where's the refutation?
Sorry. Yes?
I just add something interesting. A previous time that I learned this, the Gemara on the top, it's interesting because the pasuk, although here it's in ellipses, that they cite for the basis of Rava and some say Rav Chisda's approach actually comes from Echa, which is interesting because in that context it seems as though he's lamenting a national tragedy, a national consequence. And though oftentimes the Gemara is translated as referring to an individual, in other words, a person needs to inspect their own actions. In a previous Kaburu, which I was a part of, one of the conclusions was that actually this should be read on a nationalistic level. In other words, it's not necessarily. This is very counter to the I guess hashgacha pratit perspective, where everything we do is immediately consequential, but rather on a national level, things are consequential in a very direct way, and on an individual level, perhaps not necessarily.
That is really interesting, and I want to get back to that maybe in a source or two,
Okay.
because Rav Shagar is very much working with and responding to Rav Kook. And so questions of the meaning of historical events, specifically in the history of the Jewish people, is very important for Rav Shagar. Like this discussion comes up around the disengagement from Gaza and how do we understand that,
Oh, cool.
and things like that. I want to move on, but I think you're right that the assertion that there is some sort of absolute the good requires a starting point that's just an assertion of it, like Rabbeinu Bachai does. Just God's will is the good.
Axiomatic.
It's axiomatic, and that's all Rav Shagar is really saying. And I don't know, like what you're right. You can't critique that. Rav Shagar, I think, is not critiquing it so much as pointing out that it's something that's you starts from an axiom, and that's just sort of that.
Well, for something to be circular, don't you have to jump into it from somewhere? Meaning, if something's a circular thought, there has to be some point where you just kind of enter it, right? So I think the enter it here is you say, God's will is good, not because I perceive it to be good or you perceive it to be good, or just because that's the decision is that the axiom is like God's will is good. And then once I believe that, then I end up in the circle of God's will is good, and what happens is God's will, and if it happened and it's God's will, then it's the good, and you go round and round and round. So I think it requires that leap of faith
No, but
Oh.
of, even though logically my good can't be your good, can't be their good, can't be whatever, if it's God's will, then it is good for everybody
It
involved.
doesn't say God's will is good. God's will is the good.
No, but that's what I'm saying. Meaning, it's not that it requires leap of faith to say it's not that it's good for you and it's good for you and it's good for you. It's that it's the ultimate good. Meaning, even if I can't perceive what is good about this, if I start with the leap of faith of God's will is good, then it's good.
No. what there is no what there is good about it. That is the good.
Right.
The question itself doesn't make any sense.
I think it just requires
That is the
a
good.
statement of faith.
No.
Wait, so
No,
what's
meaning-
what's the question that you think is being asked?
Wait.
I don't know. You said the question doesn't make any sense.
No, you said. I had the question. I don't see how what God wants now is good. How that is good. That question in this position doesn't make any sense. Whatever he wants is good.
Right,
It's
exactly.
good.
No one's arguing with that.
Okay.
We're gonna. That Rosh Hashanah is saying that is this position of bitachon. You say everything that happens is God's will. God's will is by definition good. It's what defines good, and therefore you experience everything that happens as good because of those two premises you've just said. Then you experience everything as good. And the difference between these two is the question of, could I ever explain why this is good? For the Chazon Ish, in theory, if I could, see everything, understand every single, calculation, I would think what's happening is good. For Rabbeinu Bachai, that doesn't come into play. I might not ever understand why it's good, but by definition, it's good. Any thoughts or questions before we move on? Okay.
Well, so they're basically they're each taking a side of the Yusuf dilemma.
Yes.
Right? Chazon Ish says that it's good because God wills it, and or that's what Rabbeinu Bachaya says. It's good because God wills it, and then Chazon Ish says
God wills it because it's good. Yeah.
And then-
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. So this next, yeah.
חזון איש כותב, writes the book ביטחון האמונה.
Yeah.
זה spiritual language, understand? It's not a ביטחון כללית.
What? No, I know. So we talk about the bitachon. What Chazon Ish means by bitachon. Like,
ביטחון אמונית.
yeah, it's faithful.
Yes.
Okay, so this next source, number 3, is taken from the English translation. Rav Shigar's writings came out last year, called Faith Shattered and Restored. The original essay is from a Hebrew book called Luchot Shivrei Luchot. It is the pious man, the Chassid. He believes that everything befalling him expresses God's mercy and absolute goodness. To portray the pious man as someone who has gained a prize is to overlook the deeper meaning of his faith and trust in Hashem. The source of his trust is not the divine promise of happiness or redemption. It comes from surrendering his very need for security, from a willingness to accept the divine will, whatever it may be, and identify it as good. The pious man's trust is paradoxical. It's an insecure security, and it entails an excruciating inhuman concession. His security does not include a material dimension. Only thus can it lead to redemption. His world is the best of all worlds, because the meaning of the best has been fundamentally altered. It's a meaningless meaning. The world is full of nothingness, and so his nothingness is full. So this sort of builds on what we were just seeing. It's not just that you define, everything that happens as good. It's very seriously the things that are, might happen to you. You might experience them as bad. You might think those are the things you normally would say are bad. In Hebrew, Rosh Hashanah calls it bitachon she'enenu maftiach shum davar. Because maftiach promise is faith that doesn't, or trust that doesn't promise you anything, or security that secures nothing. We might think that the religious posture and religious way of living in the world is someone who's confident. God has my back. Everything that happens is gonna be fine. And that really involves a degree of imposing your understanding on God. You said this human idea of good is what God's going to fulfill. God's going to sort of live up to my understanding of what it means to be good. And even though I can't see how that works out now, in theory, God is working according to a human understanding of good. And that's why Rosh Hashanah calls this an inhuman concession. There's a sort of transcending of human understanding that happens with this understanding of bitachon, where you say even things that you might think are bad, that are not, a lack of material security, you still define them as good. And that's what it means to have bitachon, is to be able to commit yourself on that sort of level.
So just kind of like breaks the definition of good. Meaning the difference between saying God's will is good, human word good, versus God's will is ultimate,
Good lowercase.
whatever it is. Yeah, like it's ultimate right.
Right.
And I don't know what good means in that term.
So essentially, what he does is you take the word good and empty it of all content, and then just stick it right on reality. Like, what happens is by definition good, because everything that happens is because of God, and God defines what's good. What? Rabbeinu Chai. Yeah. He says that I never found myself in a situation and wish that it was otherwise.
So I think there's almost like a Buddhist idea here, in the sense that if you're sort of looking for things that are experientially good, right? So what are things that are experientially good? Are things that make you happy. And happiness is an emotion, right? It's something that your brain produces and your conscious self experiences. But you could choose, if you decide to train your mind, you could choose to say that, you know what, happy thoughts aren't important to me. What's important to me is actually divine will, and that's what's important to me. And so it's to reorient your consciousness towards divine will as opposed to experiential happiness is something which is legitimate, and it is something that makes sense. It's not just saying, oh, God's will is defined as good. It's an orientation of consciousness. You could say that this is what I care about as a human. This is what I want. I want God's will.
Right, and I think part of that is, as you said, is sort of reorienting. It might be a sort of training yourself over time kind of thing. I think it's also that you'd have to consciously just apply it anew when things come up that you still would have trouble accounting for in your new way of thinking. One thing I want to talk about here also is that it's one thing to talk about it in terms of the future. Another way of thinking of this is in terms of the present. It's not just about what's going to happen, is God's will, regardless of whether or not it fits my picture, but also what's happening now is God's will. Rosh Hagar uses the phrase Kabbalah Atzmit, self-acceptance. Is that what this level of bitachon should bring you to is of recognizing that who you are and your situation is itself how God wants things to be. That as much as, this is the opposite of the Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Yochanan story where they say, I'm not interested in this, and they help each other out of the situation. The position of Yisurim Shel Ahava, according to Rosh Hagar, this bitachon, would say the way things are is the way they're supposed to be.
But maybe we should introduce that believing in God is not a blind faith. Believing in God is living according to His commandments. So that gives another dimension to the faith in God. Why I believe that whatever God does is good is because I live according to the mitzvot, what He has ordered to me. That's the key, it seems to me.
It's part of a larger question about tzidkut v'rashut. How can you have, good and evil are spoken about a lot in the Torah, right? So how can you have that if where everything is really God's will, everything is really good? Because again, I think it goes back to what we said before, that there are different levels of functioning. There's the human reality, and then there's on a higher level of Ketzayamim, that when we have God's perspective, then it's just really is good. But
okay, so this is really good because Rosh Hagar is aware of this problem. We're going to build in this direction. But yeah, this Rosh Hagar, probably the biggest theme in his writing is this idea of self-acceptance, something he finds very powerful. But he's aware that one of the downsides of it is that it doesn't make any sense with the idea of a commandment. The idea of a commandment is there's, the reality, which might be individual, and then there's the instruction for that reality to be different. Do something, whatever it is.
Free will.
All of that requires believing in the reality and like philosophical terms, an is and an ought, a real and ideal. This is the fun way of putting it, Ritzui v'Mitzui in Hebrew. That there's the way things are and the way things should be. So in all of the Torah and Tanakh, the way things are is Bnei Israel are worshiping idols, and the way they should be is Bnei Israel should not be worshiping idols. That the Torah, by definition of giving us commands, gives us a sense of how things should be. And Rosh Hagar is really moving in this moment, in this idea, moving away from that idea, that there's, the way things are versus the way things should be.
I mean, there you can solve it the same way that you normally solve the free will problem. In other words, there is in Jewish philosophy a way of dealing with how it is that God wants things to be a certain way, and yet man is given free will. But when it comes to things which man has no control over, then I think that's when you can talk about bitachon. If you have control and you're supposed to do something, of course God wants you to do it.
Right. So part of the question is also going to be about how you experience it, and if you guys are bring that up when we see an approach more like that, I want to look at one third source in this topic first, so the fourth source. Great. So this is from a book called Nahalech Baragash. This is from a very long essay Rav Shigar has there on the meaning of bitachon. As opposed to the other ones, which are essays from larger topics, this is his big treatment of it. And this is where the rest of the sources are going to come from. So he says here, source number 4, the highest divine revelation appears in the world as shadow. He quotes from Midrash, like the apple tree amidst the trees of the forest, so my beloved among men. Which the Midrash explains, just as the apple tree provides no shade, and therefore everyone flees from it, so too my beloved. Everyone flees from him, but I sit in his shade and enjoy. This shade does not provide security to the one who shelters in it, and despite this, the Jewish people desire to sit in this minimal shade. The highest divine reality, that of Almadit Kasyat, the concealed world, casts shadows of suffering. But these shadows provide the possibility of a closeness to God greater than all the life of this world. So that's a really intense sort of theology of suffering, but it's in many ways an extension of what we just saw, which is that if there's some idea that God is beyond our limited human concept of good, then the more we get out of our concept of good, you might say the closer we get to God. So if we have a way we understand the world should run, and that's a very human way of how the world should run, then anything that contradicts that might be experienced as divine. God is totally other from our own ways of understanding things. Then when God manifests in this world, not through human ways of running the world, isn't it? You could say that God runs the world sometimes, via things working out well, but that would always be a concession to human understanding.
And this is sort of the middle position between Rabbeinu Bachai and the Chazon Ish. In other words, if you believe that there's some magical mystical world that you can't see that has klipot and nitzotzot and magical things that you change the sphirot and the world, the universe blows up or something like that, right? So then you're asserting that there does exist a real morality apart from God. And that, or some real good apart from God, and that real good has to do with this sort of mystical universe that we're not attuned to. But God is actually trying to optimize for the mystical world, as opposed to saying it's just whatever God wants. No, God has a plan that involves magical things that is real, and it's just you can't experience it.
I'm not sure I understood entirely. I do think there's a slightly different nuance here from before that appears in the fact that he's not quoting Rabbeinu Bachai here, because Rabbeinu Bachai really leans into, what's God's will is by definition good, and without sort of denying that, Rav Shigar here emphasizes more the human perspective, where he's not going to go with the path of the Buddhists that you mentioned, where you retrain yourself to experience God's will as good. He's going to say that on some level we have human understanding, and we're kind of stuck in it, and we're going to experience certain things as suffering.
I guess I'm asking, what's this concealed world that he's talking about? Is that just God's will, or is there some mystical universe that we're not attuned to?
That is, by the time it gets through the Chassidut to Rav Shigar, you could ask him when exactly this change happens, but Rav Shigar certainly is just talking about a sort of core experience of God, an experience of God not through human or intermediary categories of any sort. That it's an experience of God as God manifesting into the human world, and therefore by definition sort of upsetting the human world and not fitting into the normal sort of human experiencing categories. That God cannot manifest humanly in a sense.
Mm-hmm. because there is a Kabbalistic direction in these kinds of questions, which really is that, right? That there are klipot, there are nitzotzot, everything,
Right.
mitzvot, and everything that happens is about, fixing the world in terms of these things that you can't see.
So, to the degree that, like the Kabbalah, the Ari, is very much about, humans being able to affect the divine and sort of work with God that way, Chassidut moves away from that, and Rosh Hashanah even more so.
Mhm.
That there's a lot of this is about a very humble posture and not trying to sort of affect the divine.
Is he saying here though that really the ultimate closeness to God is only felt through suffering?
That's also what I felt from the Buddhist.
Is
Right,
that, I mean,
like-
that's kind of what.
Because he's saying when it's good, how do you know if that's human or that's God? Really, only when it's suffering do you know that it's God.
Right.
Is
it's-
it that is the best way to be close to God is through suffering?
Right. So one thing that it definitely wouldn't mean is hurt yourself in any sense. It would have to be something. It's very passive posture. That it would be, but it does seem to lean in that direction. That like really suffering that happens to you is the highest way of experiencing it. I think it would be important to connect it back to his discussion and the Gemara's discussion of Yisurim Sha'ahava, the sufferings of love specifically, as opposed to suffering in general, meaning some suffering for which you can find no reason, no explanation.
And that's where closeness to God is found.
That would not necessarily be the only place,
But
but
you're saying the
this
greatest, like the
100%
It's
is
the highest.
the highest, and it's a little bit terrifying.
And
It's-
that's totally because you don't have any distraction from it. Meaning, it could be that the same exact closeness is happening with good things. It's just that you're distracted by the fact that those are good into thinking, oh, this makes so much sense to me, but that's because it's human good.
right.
So only when it's not human good can I say, wow, this is really God. Because
Right. So
I
definitely,
don't think it's good.
definitely one thing that his formulation doesn't leave open here is that God manifesting in this world could just sort of happen to work with what we think is good. Essentially, like what Toby says, of training ourselves to experience that as good.
Well, if all of it is good, then even when you think it's good, it's also good.
Yes,
But it's
exactly.
just that it's not as visibly good because you're distracted by the fact that it's also human good.
Yeah. So I think that one thing I sort of find of value in this posture is what do I do when I experience that moment of intense suffering or whatever. And at that moment, it's about humility and the ability. In a different text, Shigar talks about it as Mesirat Nefesh, sort of passionately committing myself to the understanding that this is something God is doing. That it's not just an accident and not my sins making it happen. It's God, and that's what it means to find God's closeness there. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that idea that through suffering we get closer to God is something that also exists elsewhere in Chazal. I mean, see that a broken heart, right? That really a liv shabu that produces the best feeling because it's humbling that I have no power. I can't have any. I'm nothing. I'm just batal. I am nullified before God, and I'm therefore closer to Him because I have nothing. I'm part of Him. You meld into the greater God conscious. And maybe that's what we're talking about. That's really experiencing God on the highest level.
But then you wouldn't want to not view it as suffering. You want to view it as suffering because then you know that you're getting close to God.
I think there's a sort of double consciousness involved there of this is a human experience of suffering, and then also understanding that it's from God.
Well, maybe that's why Shigar has to start by saying there's no way to disassociate that human consciousness of suffering. Meaning the first part here was but humans suffer, so how are we supposed to think that it's not suffering, it's suffering? And only once you're aware of the reality of, I'm going to think this is suffering, can you then say, but also, it's from God.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's some level of recognizing that what you are experiencing as suffering is good, even if you don't experience that in the most immediate sense. And this is a little farther away from Rabbeinu B'chaya, who was experiencing things as good because he's able to see through that sort of godly way of seeing.
Not only is he able to see through, it's not about even seeing through. He doesn't see a value then in suffering. Saying from this perspective, there's a value of suffering that is closeness. Do you know
That's
what I'm
true,
saying?
yeah.
So like
On this level.
That's true. I think I brought this text because it's one of the most extreme formulations I've found in Rav Shigar of this. More commonly, I think what he finds more of the emphasis on this is the question of when I am close to God, when I feel like I have a relationship with God, does that promise me something? As I heard recently, Fashi Shai Leibovitz used to say, God's not an ATM machine. And that's the basic idea Rav Shigar is getting at here in the slightly less extreme formulations of bitachon in God, trusting in God, is not trusting that God's going to give you something and that everything's going to work out the way it makes sense to you. It's about committing yourself to God. And he has some very powerful readings of Megillat Esther, where he talks about when Esther goes before Ahasuerus, she's not confident that she's going to survive. It's just what she's got to do. She commits herself to that, even given the possibility of death. And when Mordechai speaks to her and says, maybe this is why you ended up in the kingship, he's not making a statement about God's running everything to make sure that everyone's going to be safe, because then he says, Jewish people are going to be fine, but we could be wiped out. Like our family could disappear. That bitachon and the Megillah is a great example of this, is not about what God is going to give you, it's about your committing yourself to God. And that's, I think, what Shigar mostly wants to get to here. And to some degree, the logical extension of it would be this idea that suffering is some form of closeness. Okay, I want to move on to the next section, which is where Shigar is going to really switch gears. And if that whole first idea is about self-acceptance, the Rav Shigar has a whole other approach to the way of thinking about yourself and the world you live in that I call self-construction, the ability to take a more active role in building yourself and creating the world. And so here, he's going to find that as a form of bitachon. He's working off the writings of Rav Hillel of Parich, who was a Chabad thinker, student of the second Chabad Rebbe, if I remember correctly. And to talk about this entirely sort of different idea of bitachon. Source number 5 is again from Nalach Baragash. Paradoxically, the logic of self-nullification leads to a parabolic movement culminating in a return to the world. The righteous person nullifies himself, but in this lack of nullification, the non-spiritual worldly life itself becomes a nullification, a vessel for infinite light, an instance of existing but not in existence. The divide between creator and creature, between a righteous person and his creator, blurs. A person like this is an instance of the righteous person is the foundation of the world, and he's modeled after the supernal Yesod, foundation meaning Yesod. For God is in heaven and you are on earth, you on the earth are modeled after God in heaven. So that's there's a lot in that dense paragraph. The quotation at the end is from Rav Hillel of Parich. And I want to go through it quickly. I want to draw something very quickly. I meant to bring a Sharpie, it'd be easier to see, but this will be enough. So I was talking before about ideal and real, reality and command. We have two levels, right? We have like the way things are and the way things are supposed to be, which in the previous discussion we were talking about like the way things are and versus our idea of the good. And in that first model of self-acceptance, Rav Shigar is basically saying, if this is our idea of the good, we should just get rid of it. And what's really the ideal, the good, is the way things are already, right? We sort of live on the bottom of these two lines, and we always are stuck striving to get to the top line. We have the way things are, and we always want them to be some other kind of way. And Rav Shigar is saying self-acceptance means that's the other kind of way we want it to be. That's not how God wants it to be. And we should forget about that and only live on this sort of bottom line. Make sense to everyone? Okay, because what happens here is, Rav Shigar says, there's a parabolic motion. You go like that. You go from the bottom to the top and back down again. You go from a living sort of in our world to a more sort of refined spiritual existence, where you collapse those two lines back together, and then you come back.
So he's proposing living not in the ideal.
Not in the ideal. Coming back to reality.
Or that there is no ideal.
What?
No,
Right.
there is an ideal.
What?
There is an
Well-
ultimate ideal.
So, what happens in this sort of dense paragraph is the righteous person nullifies himself. In this, the lack of nullification, the non-spiritual worldly life itself, becomes nullification, a vessel for the infinite light. So, if we talked before this idea of living in a like spiritual consciousness of the things that happen are what God is making happen, whether you're experiencing that or simply like deciding that's the truth, even if you experience it as suffering. We're now talking about moving like past that to even not thinking of things as divine is divine. He started off by using the word paradoxical. And essentially the human idea of what good is, God made us that way. God created us in a world where we experience reality in tension with the way we want things to be, where we experience reality in tension with the command. The chairs over there. And I apologize, this text is a very dense text in the Hebrew. So the idea is that we don't. In the first half, we said that there's human experience, the way we normally try to experience it, and Rav Shigar's bitachon is about transcending that and getting out of that human experience, right? So now he's saying that living in that human experience is itself something divine, that God is present in everything, including in our sense of normal human life and the way we experience them. So because of that, he says that the divide between creator and creature, between a righteous person and his creator, blurs. He's building on lines from the Gemara, like Tzaddik goes over Kadosh Baruch Hu Mekayim, that God, even the Tzaddik, decrees and God fulfills. Or I don't remember what text is probably might be as Zohar, but it might be a Gemara Midrash, which is that if Tzaddikim wanted, they could create worlds. That the Gemara really sort of, or those texts really sort of blur the line between Tzaddik and the Creator, and then that reaches a sort of peak in Kabbalah, which identifies one of God's sefirot, the sefirah responsible for like affecting our world, Yesod, with the Tzaddik, because the pasuk in Mishlei says Tzaddik Yesod Olam, Tzaddik is connected to Yesod. It's so the Kabbalah says that Tzaddik can affect the world, and Chassidut really builds on this, the same way God can affect the world. For you on the earth are like God in heaven, the same way God is in heaven as creator and bestower of goodness, so too you are on earth. And so this is a shift from the first model we saw, primarily in terms of passivity and activity. The first model we saw is about how you understand the things that are happening to you. And Rav Shigar is going to be doing here is moving away from that and saying that it's not like, when things happen to us, we should get out of our normal human mindset and understand that they're really from God. Things being from God is not separate from the things that we do. It's not like, God does things to us and we have to accept them or not. Our actions are also divine. So when we act on at ourselves and our environment to try and change things, that's not separate from God doing stuff. We shouldn't. It's weird in a sense that we say, there's a thing God does and the things we do. It's part of, in a sense, how we experience things. Getting back to that, but it requires drawing lines that aren't obvious. If God really, shapes us in significant ways, then the things that we do are divine. Questions?
Would he say that though this still is within, like when we're talking about humans, like from the Rambam's perspective of like independent existence versus dependent existence? So us having like a different level of existence, would he say that we're still within the level of a dependent existence, or would he make the leap to say that we're now a part of an independent existence? Like when we're saying that, because you use the word divine, I don't know
Yeah.
what that means in this context.
Right. So, I think Rambam's dichotomy there may not be so helpful because a lot of this is working off a very different way of thinking. Rambam's understanding of like God and not God is very binary. Rambam's metaphysics is fundamentally there's God, there's not God, gotta keep them separate. And that's exactly what he's trying to undo here, is that the line between creature and creator blurs.
So he would take that independent existence into the dependent world. Like,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's not terms I'm used to thinking in as much, but I think so. Yeah.
I mean, so to me, the main sort of thrust of this paragraph is that, so in a lot of like mystical Jewish thought, there's like the Olam HaRuchani and the Olam HaGashmi. Right? There's the physical world and the spiritual world. And here what he's saying is that, no, in as much as the physical world represents God's will, the physical world is just as spiritual as,
Yeah,
whatever
the distinction
exists.
between spiritual and non-spiritual assumes a boundary that doesn't make any sense if you believe in God as the source of everything, or everything is being permeated by the divine in some sense.
Yeah.
In other texts, he talks about like we think of panimi and chitzoni, of internal and external, and that's not something that necessarily makes sense if God is both external and internal equally. Anyone else for the next text? This bitachon is the bitachon of the Mashiach, of the righteous person who can draw down abundance that is divine and not simply spiritual, and can even guarantee success in the realm of external reality. For a Parich, this messianic bitachon is not just certainty about success, but even the ability to create that success. Here too there's a paradox. The righteous person accepts the yoke of the kingship of heaven, which means absolute obedience, even in the realm of action. However, this leads to the unity of the inner and outer world, and to the inverse capacity for control in the external world. The righteous person becomes a God on earth, like the model of God in heaven. The non-spiritual renunciation, that is accepting the yoke of kingship of heaven, leads to a spiritualization of reality, without making it any less substantive. Reality becomes a dwelling in the lower realms, a medium for the divine presence. The righteous person also becomes a chariot for the Shekhinah, a unity that gives him the power of the Creator. Bitachon, which until now had led to passively responding, becomes the ability to actively create. So several people earlier mentioned the idea that God gives us mitzvot, and God, the hilchot of Shiva, and things that all assume various forms of human consciousness, either the experience of suffering, of bad things happening, or that God tells us to do things and we have free will to do them. And what he's saying here is, right, that consciousness, that feeling of being separate from God, that, I'm an independent entity with free will, who can fulfill commandments, or who experiences suffering and should respond accordingly, that itself is divine. That when we say, oh no, only the experience of divine oneness is divine, you're saying that my experience is something outside of divine oneness. You're saying that I can wall off my own normal human consciousness from God. No, God created you who you are, as we said in the whole first set, right? So that the way things are is the way God wants them to be. That includes our experience of the way things are. That includes us feeling like I'm a human. I suffer. I have a way I would like things to be that differs from how they are now. And it also includes our actions responding to those circumstances. That's why I started with the Gemara from the end of that Gemara at the beginning, where the proper response to suffering is action, is some sort of acting on that reality to try and fix it. And that's where Rav Shigar thinks really believing that everything's from God actually leads. There's some level of believing that God is behind everything, absolutely everything, doesn't lead to passivity. It leads you to saying, right, God is behind my choices too. God wants me to do things and act in the world. And in fact, I'm an agent of God in that sense. That part of how God acts in the world is through me doing stuff. Questions? Yeah, I'm seeing the face. You can keep asking.
Could you then create something that would be against God? Like he's giving us this creative power.
Right, I think.
It's freedom of choice. Freedom of choice. Whatever you want.
Well, I think like no, because the by definition thing like we're working here. Just by definition, everything is driven by God. So I don't know what it would mean to be against God in that sense.
On a
Then
certain
what are
level,
we
it's like it's
creating?
not
If it's
from
all
negative,
if it's all through God and it's all according to God, then what?
Well, no, because the question is, I think it's very important to focus on human experience here. That
We can experience that.
no, but the importance here is you're experiencing suffering, right? For a second, what do you do with that? Do you accept it as from God? Because the thing that happens to me is from God, but my actions that I could do to resolve it aren't from God? Or do I say also my ability to act on it is from God? I'll give a concrete example. I was preparing for this year. I was thinking a lot about good examples. I think this is the one that I kept coming back to, which is I'm diabetic. That was just diagnosed a couple of years ago, and so on one level I can take as that's from God, right? That's something that just God did to me, and I have to learn to experience that as from God, and that would be the first part of this year. But it's not a passive condition. I can act on it, right? And so it's not like, oh, how do I respond to the things God did to me, right? You point out that source number 4 is very intense about suffering possibly being like the most divine experience you could have. So should I let my illness get worse in order to have a more divine experience? No, that's the question that source raises. And the flip side, which we're saying here, is no, I should also recognize that God gave me the ability and motivation in order to act on my suffering and to respond to it. And that activity is itself also divine.
And doesn't distance you from God, even though you're distancing yourself from the suffering.
No, but that's also because part of what he's doing here is saying it's weird that we think it's possible to be distant from God. Right? The feeling of being distant from God is itself from God. The idea, so I just talked about this on Shabbat. It was last week's parsha was Parshat Va'era, and God says to Moshe, "I'm appearing to you as Yud Kei Vav Kei, as opposed to I have appeared to the Avot as Kel Shakai." And the Midrash explains it. Rashi brings it is that Yud Hey Vav Hey means God fulfills His promises. El Shaddai means God does not fulfill His promises. And the Midrash says God appeared to the Avot as someone who makes promises but does not fulfill them because they never saw the fulfillment of God's promises to them. We're saying God has a form of appearing. He appeared to the Avot as an absence, as something that's not fulfilled. That form, that like absence of God, is in fact a form of God appearing. That's the idea people call Hester Panim, right? God hides Himself. God is present by hiding Himself. That's what He's doing here right now, is hiding Himself. So one way of being close to God is by recognizing that your experience of distance from God is also from God. So it's weird to say that it's distant. It's just a different form of relationship, a different form of divinity. So yeah, just to sort of tie all that back together, I'm talking here about two forms of bitachon we've seen. So the bitachon she'enenu mavtiach shum davar, the security that doesn't secure you anything, trust in God that doesn't promise you anything materially, and this form was like, no, actually, bitachon does promise you stuff because you can go make things better, right? You can build a better world. You can make success for yourself. And the question, as I said, these two sort of passive and active ways of relating to God and to the world come up throughout Rav Shagar's teaching, writings. The question is, how do you deal with those two things? He gives you two models and then doesn't really tell you which one to pick. He does say that this second model is messianic as opposed to the first. He does, in context of faith, he talks about self-acceptance versus like choice, and says that the active choice model is a higher level because he feels it's much more free and chosen out of free will. It's just a constant tension, like how do you make those fit together? And I have sort of two thoughts. I'd love to hear others One is, this doesn't come from his thought, but it might be what's going on in the Gemara, is your own suffering versus other people's suffering. Like maybe you should accept your own suffering and make other people's better. There's a line from, I think, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, one of the big Musar teachers, that says that your so that other people's gashmius is your ruchnius. Their physical existence and happiness is your spiritual responsibility. So that might be one option. And the other option is, I think, that this question of, we've come back to again and again, of human experience. That you experienced some things as unchangeable and some things as changeable. And so that might be the question of how you are supposed to decide, might be the answer to how you decide what you're supposed to work on and what you're not, is the things you experience as, I can fix that, I can make that better. That is, a place for me to have this sort of messianic bitachon of realizing that my ability to act on that and change things and fix things is itself from God, versus when you can't affect it, when it's just something that overwhelms you, and isn't beyond your capacity to fix, then that might be more important to realize that it's from God as it is. Any other thoughts, possibilities?
So, this sort of issue of asking to change things versus like framing the way you think is not just a problem in Judaism. I think that it's a problem in general, right? When you have crap that happens to you in life, so how do you deal with that? And at least like one of the approaches is cognitive behavioral therapy, where there's a cognitive aspect and also a behavioral aspect, right? So the cognitive aspect is that you reframe the way that you think about certain problems in your life, and there's a behavioral aspect, which is that for some things that you change your behavior. So I don't think it has to be different approaches. I think that many times in life you need both. You need a way to think about things, and you also need a way to direct your behavior.
Yeah.
I think it also sounds like steps. Like if the first step is to say, this is from God, and this is where I am, and I can recognize this as suffering, and that's okay, and whatever, and then to act, and then to say, but also God gave me the ability to act on it, and the responsibility to act on it, then you can kind of like make that a rolling process. First you have to recognize where it's coming from, and then you get to act on it.
Right. I think it's also happening here in piece number 5, where he says that the logic of bitul, self-obligation, ultimately leads back to the world. I thank you everyone for coming. I hope it was interesting at least.
Thank you so much, Levi. Just really quick,